Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback portion of your screen, where you will see the video timeline with chapter titles and links to those specific points in the video. Or you can use the timestamp links down in the video description. In this week's podcast, I have 3 tidbits. I have a couple of updates on works in progress, and then I want to talk about how you can take more control over your own knitting. So let's get started. My first tidbit is a video that showed up in my YouTube subscription box, and it's from a YouTube channel called Tiny Fibre Studio, and I'll put a link down below to the particular video, and then you can see other videos on her channel as well. The name of the person who does the videos, her name is Bex, and she lives in the UK. So when I first came across it was a couple of years ago when this book called 51 Yarns to Spin Before You Cast Off came out. This was written by J.C. Boggs Faulkner, who publishes Ply magazine, which is a magazine for spinners. And the idea here is mainly it's like a way, it's like a journaling process to try different types of spinning different types of yarns. And some of them might be ones that you wouldn't necessarily seek out to spin on your own, but it's like, here, try this. So it doesn't tell you how to spin those types of yarns. It just tells you, try this. And so then it's up to you to go and research it. So I first came across Bex when she was working her way through this book. And I found it really interesting. She's a very good spinner, so it was very interesting. The video that she published this week is on the parts of a spinning wheel. So if you are a new spinner, or you're thinking about learning to spin, or even if you're a fairly experienced spinner but you don't really know the parts of your spinning wheel, could be a really interesting video, because she does an excellent job of showing close-ups of each part of the wheel, and they're highlighted so you can really tell what it is she's talking about. And she shows you different types of spinning wheels and where those particular components are on different types of wheels. So I found that to be really helpful, and it might be something you're interested in too. Last week, I had a tidbit about an online event called the Knitting History Forum, and it was it's an event that normally takes place in person, and there's a lot of textile academics that participate in this conference. So this year they are doing it online, and they're inviting anybody to come free. And I was telling you about it last week. Well, Saturday, someone left a comment on last week's Casual Friday and said that all the tickets were gone, that they've closed registration, which was a surprise. I didn't realize there were limits. I think what happened was so many people were signing up, they realized, wait a second, we need to make sure that we have moderators and keep everything secure for that number of people. I think it's an in-person event normally, and it wouldn't be that large. So they might have been surprised by the number of people who've been signing up around the world. I don't know. And I don't think it's because of me. I think it's been talked about online. But a couple of days ago, they opened up registration again. So I think they just closed it temporarily in order to get things sorted out, and it is open again. So it's on Saturday, November 7th. It starts at 10:30 a.m. UK time, and which is 4:30 in the morning our time. They have a whole program. I'll also leave links down to where you can see what the actual program is. So you don't have to come in at 10:30 and stay for the whole thing. They have different scheduled events, and you can enter into the conference room at the start of any of those particular scheduled events. So again, I'll leave links down below, and you should be able to register for that if that's of interest to you. And the last tidbit that I have is really just a reminder that if you are having problems with a project that you want help with, and you wonder if I can help you, I certainly can, and I'm happy to help people with their knitting projects. However, I can only do this within my Ravelry group. And the reason I can only do it then is because it becomes unmanageable if people are sending me private messages from different places. So I tend to get private messages pretty frequently from Facebook. And I think that there are a certain number of knitters who, to them, Facebook is the internet, and they're in different Facebook groups and they spend their internet time on Facebook, and they're not really familiar with other places. And when they watch my videos, maybe they're watching them from an embedded link in Facebook. So I just want to let you know that I am happy to help people solve their knitting problems, but not on a one-to-one basis in private message. I just can't do that. My goal is to educate as many knitters as I can. And if I am helping people individually, one-on-one, nobody else can learn from that exchange. And in addition, if somebody else has the same question and I'm answering 2 separate people or 3 separate people individually who have the same question, that just makes it's too much of a burden for me. But my Ravelry group is closing in on 6,000 people, so that is where my actual community is, where people can interact. The volume of posts per day is not that high. I will respond to every single post that somebody creates if they have a question. I may not always have the answer. I may not be the one who has the answer, but I will respond. And my response may be, I don't know how to answer your question, but here are some ideas for where you can find those answers. But there are other people in that group who are very active and often will respond with their suggestions and their experiences if it's in an area of knitting that I just don't spend much time on, and they do. So it's a really valuable resource, but I'm sorry I can't help you through Facebook messages. I'm just not on Facebook much at all. And I don't see those messages, and I just can't respond to them. So that is just to let you guys know that that's how you can get help from me. So I started a project, I don't know, a week or so ago. And it wasn't one that I had intended to start, but I was kind of in between things. I didn't really have a project that I was actively had that I could work on. And it was one of those kind of weekends where I just wanted some mindless knitting, and I was kind of struggling with what could I do. And I got a text from one of my oldest daughter's friends from college. When my daughter went to college, she took with her a sweater that I had knit for her for starting college, and several pairs of hand knit socks. And her friends observed her socks and like, your socks are so cool. And she's like, oh, my mom made them for me. They're like, really? You're so lucky. So I would make socks for her roommates, for her friends. I'd make knitted hats for them. I would make fingerless mittens, whatever they wanted, I would make. I was completely happy to. They were so enthusiastic. They weren't saying, oh, can your mom make this for me? It was like, those are so neat. You're so lucky. And my daughter would ask me, would you make her some? And I would say, sure. So that is completely fine, because I do not knit except by choice and knit for love. So I won't knit for money. I don't knit on commission. I absolutely refuse to do that. If you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done, just not something that I want to do with my knitting time. So one of her roommates from when she first graduated, she had 2 roommates. They were both named Nicole. One of the Nicoles and I have had a relationship every so often. She started doing some genealogical research, and she knew that I did it, and I knew a lot about it, and could I help her figure out this thing or that thing or the other thing, and I was totally happy to do that. Well, out of the blue, I heard from her a couple of weeks ago, and she said, could I commission you to knit a pair of socks, or could I buy a pair of hand knit socks from you? And I was like, that came out of nowhere. And I said, well, are the socks for you? She said, yes, ma'am. And I said, oh, well, I don't knit for money. I don't knit on commission, but I do knit for love, and you qualify, so I'm happy to do it. And she did everything I told her in order for me to be able to knit her a pair of socks, which was, she traced her foot, she took the measurements. I have this sock tutorial called August Sock Knit Along that tells how to measure feet and how to predict where you're going to have fit issues, and then all the different choices for heels and toes and how to modify for all that. But in that tutorial, there's a page that shows with a picture that shows where to measure, and then there's a whole piece of paper for here's where you trace it and here's where you write down these different measurements. So I just sent her that page of the tutorial. And sure enough, she took all her measurements and she mailed them back to me. And then I was asking her about sock colors, and she wanted like a forest green. I have a lot of bright greens, but I don't really have any dark greens in my stash. So I was thinking, well, I might have to buy something. So I sent her photos of what I had hanging above me, which sometimes you can see if I'm standing in a Technique Tuesday video. You can see the bottoms of those skeins. Or at the beginning of one of my videos where you'll see this bunch of rainbow skeins and then it says Rox Knits. It was one of those that was hanging up there. So she picked one of those. And so I started knitting her a sock, and just happy to have a new person to knit for. And that is currently what I am working on in terms of a project in progress. I have been asked about my 1890s sweater, when am I getting back to that? And I will be getting back to that soon. I often mention that if a project takes more than a certain length of time, I need a break from it, and I needed a break from that. But I'm getting restless, and I'm going to need a sweater project to be working on, and that one is one I can just pick up. So we'll be getting back to that very soon. So this week's Technique Tuesday video was on unintentionally twisted stitches, and I explained a couple of different scenarios in which a knitter could end up with twisted stitches in their fabric when they did not intend to. So sometimes it just is a result of you have maybe ripped back a few rows, so you had all your stitches off the needle and you had to recapture them, and when you knit across those stitches the first time, some of them ended up twisted. But another scenario is if you are switching from knitting in the round to knitting flat, and then all of a sudden you notice that every other row is twisted. Or you might be knitting flat and switching to in the round knitting, and then all of a sudden all of your stitches are twisted. And that comes from having a knitting style called combination knitting, and I explained it a bit in that video, and I'll link the technique video above. But one of the questions I got in the comments was about intentionally twisted stitches, because she saw the way that some of the stitches were twisting and she thought it looked really cool, and she wondered if there's any reason why you wouldn't want to deliberately include twisted stitches. And the answer is you absolutely can include twisted stitches. The point is always to get the result that you want. And so if you are wanting untwisted stitches and you're getting them, then you need to figure out how to prevent that. But the flip side of that is if you want deliberately twisted stitches, how do you get that? So there are some traditional knitting styles that incorporate twisted stitches. One of them is commonly known as Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. They're traditional stitch patterns that come from the Enstal Valley in Bavaria, Austria, and like northern Italy. And they're these very delicate looking traveling twisted stitch patterns. So the knits are all twisted and the purls are just worked as plain purls. And those knit stitches are usually traveling in a single column of knit stitches across this background of purl. And when they meet another one, they cross over, but they create these really beautiful, intricate designs. I actually have several knitting patterns for fingerless mitts that incorporate these stitch patterns. They were traditionally used in men's and women's stockings as part of their national costume of that region. And then as the Industrial Revolution hit and clothing manufacturing changed, that tradition started to evaporate and was nearly lost until two different women in like the 70s and 80s kind of made an effort to collect all of the stitch patterns by looking at examples of stockings in people's private collections, but also in these folk museums where there might be an actual stocking, or there might be a strip of fabric that was basically like a stitch dictionary, where there would be a certain stitch pattern worked for a while, and then the next one would be worked for the next while. And it was basically like having a stitch dictionary, and people could borrow them from each other, like borrow it and figure out what it was and incorporate it into their own little strip of sample knitting that they could then use if they wanted to knit stockings at another time. Another option is to go onto Ravelry in the advanced search, and under fabric characteristics, you can choose twisted stitches, or you can look in, there's a category or an attribute or filter, I can't remember the term they use for it, but it's for regional / ethnic types of knitting, and you can choose Bavarian there, and then you'll get patterns that include these types of traditional stitch patterns. So the two stitch dictionaries that I use, one of them is a 3-booklet set from a woman named Maria Erlbacher. Erlbacher. I'll put links down below. Those 3 booklets were produced by a museum in Bavaria, but they have been translated into English into one volume that Schoolhouse Press publishes here in the US called Twisted Stitch Knitting. And the other 3-volume set is much larger and includes some history, but it's in Bavarian German, so it's in a dialect of German. So you can't read that text, but the stitch patterns are all charted. And those books are by a woman named Liesl Fandrel, and I'll put links down below. The Liesl Fandrel books were reprinted. There was a new edition that came out within the past 7-8 years, but it might be out of print, so you'd probably have to get them used or through a library system somehow. But they're both of them are excellent sources for those stitch patterns. I want to give you an update on this sweater that I'm reverse engineering, and the pockets, my plan for the pockets. I was telling you about how I had swatched last week for a pocket, and I liked the idea that I came up with, but I knew that I was going to have to revise it, and because there were a couple of issues with it. So I want to do some overhead to show you what the original pocket looked like, and then what the new version of it looked like, and then what I'm going to do in the actual sweater. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about how I use swatching, because a lot of people say, oh, I hate to swatch, it's a waste of time and it's a waste of yarn and blah 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 blah, I don't want to do it. And nobody is forcing you to do swatches. What I will say is that because I often use the same sorts of yarns, they're nearly identical, even if they're different brands. They function almost exactly the same, these sort of standard 3 or 4 ply worsted weight wool yarns that I use to knit sweaters with. I usually don't need to do a stockinette swatch, because I know what needles I'm going to need to get the gauge that I want when I'm using that yarn. But that doesn't mean I don't swatch. The purpose of swatches is to learn something. So if you are not going to learn anything from a swatch, then yes, it is a waste of time and a waste of yarn. That is why I don't do a stockinette swatch for worsted weight wool. I wouldn't learn anything from it. I probably would do a swatch if it were a completely different fiber, or if it were a different sort of yarn construction that I hadn't used before, and I wasn't really sure if I was going to need the same needle or not, because different yarn constructions can require a different needle size than you would normally need to use in order to get the exact same gauge. So I do swatch, make stockinette swatches sometimes, but there are reasons, and it's because I'm working with something that I'm unfamiliar with and I need to learn something. Most of the swatches I do are to teach something or to learn something myself that has nothing to do with what is the stockinette gauge. It usually has to do with understanding a different gauge for a stitch pattern. It's to understand how stitch patterns are going to work together in a garment, or it's to figure out how to modify something if a modification is going to work. So it's always to learn something, and in some cases I do them in order to teach something. So my Technique Tuesday videos are often include swatches that are really of no purpose. I'm not going to make a project based on that. It's to show what happens if you do a certain thing. So like my Tuesday video, I was showing examples that knitters might experience as combination knitters if they went from knitting in the round to knitting flat, and all of a sudden they realized every other row was twisted. Like, what does that look like? So you can learn a lot from swatches. So I sometimes will get questions in a technique video from people wanting to know, well, could I use that increase instead of the increase that my project calls for? Because I don't like the one that my project calls for. Or my project calls for a certain type of cast on. Could I use this one instead? Well, that is a perfect opportunity to do a swatch, because if you try it out, first of all, you'll learn the new technique and you'll learn, do I even like the process of doing this particular cast on method, or do I find it horrible? Or it's going to take me a while to get muscle memory to do this. I might need to practice it. So you practice that different cast on, and you make a swatch that includes something from the project you're intending to knit, like, does it transition well into the stitch pattern that you need to use? Or is there some other consideration you need to think about? So that's the sort of thing that you can answer best yourself, because oftentimes there's no reason, there's no physical reason why you can't substitute one increase for another if they both give you a new stitch, for example. But there might be a good reason why you wouldn't want to use it in your specific project, because it might mess up the look of how stitch patterns are being created. But I don't know that, and I wouldn't necessarily know, even if I did know the stitch pattern you were going to use, I wouldn't necessarily know what the best increase was. I have favorite increases, and that favorite increase kind of shifts over time. And often I will I'll start a project and I'll think, oh, I'm going to mirror my increases this way. I'm going to have one lean this way and the other one lean that way. And I'm going to use, increase number A. I do that. I don't like the way it looks. So I think, well, what happens if I just swap them so that they're leaning in the opposite direction, but it's the same increase, but mirroring them opposite? Well, that's better, but I'm still not happy. Well, what if I use this other increase instead? Because sometimes it's a very specific situation that's causing the fabric not to look the way that I would prefer it to look. So I would recommend, if you have a question like that, that you can answer it, and you are going to learn a lot more by trying it out yourself on a swatch than you're going to learn from me just telling you an answer. So I want to show you the pocket swatch update. So this is the pocket swatch that I showed you last week. So the way that this pocket is formed is that there are these two cables and that are each 15 stitches wide, and then there's 5 purl stitches in between. And the original pocket started the opening right at the edge of this pocket and ended at 3 stitches before this one ended. And then there was ribbing that was extending up that interfered with having a crossing going like this across the opening of the pocket. There was just more of an interruption of the pattern. So what I did is I wanted to center it. in the center of the two cables. And so I have 2 stitches at each end instead. And then I had an idea that I wanted to create an actual full lining, so it's like a pouch, and that I would create it in the round starting at the bottom, and then I would join the stitches of the pocket. They have to be the same number of stitches for the pocket as there were for the front. And I would join those 2 sets of stitches together using a type of bind off called a 3-needle I-cord bind off. So it's sort of a hybrid of a 3-needle bind off, but instead of just passing stitches over, I'm creating an I-cord bind off at the same time. So I thought that it might look good in this contrast color, and that this I-cord would resemble these crossing ropes pretty similar. They would just be a cool effect. So I liked the effect. I didn't know what I was going to do about the 2 I-cord endings here, like what I could do so that they weren't just on the surface but were somehow hidden underneath. And the second thing is that cables pull the fabric in. They have a different gauge than stockinette gauge. So you have more stitches per inch in a cable than you do in just stockinette. And what was happening at the top of this cable is that as I was doing the bind off, it was causing all of these stitches here to flare to the full width of stockinette. And so I needed to figure out a way to narrow the top so that I would have fewer stitches, but it wouldn't be obvious that there were fewer stitches. And then I would need to, and I wanted to make the pocket smaller too. I wanted to make it narrower because when I used the full number of 31 stitches for each half, it was wider because this is stockinette. It was wider than the pocket. So I wanted to narrow the pocket, and I want to have fewer stitches, but I needed to have fewer stitches for the front of the pocket here. But for the back of the pocket, it needed to be the same number of stitches as this was above it, because this is the continuation of the pattern. So I had to join the pocket stitches with this so that it was the same number. So I had a few problems I needed to solve. So this is the second version, and it looks better. You don't see that flaring. What I decided to do was to eliminate 4 stitches across the top, and I did it so that it wouldn't be noticeable. I eliminated 2 stitches when I did this final cable crossing right here. So these cable crossings, there's 3 stitches crossing over 3 stitches. So I have these stitches on a cable needle, and they're held to the back. These are crossing over. I knit stitch number 1, I knit stitch number 2, and when I was going to knit stitch number 3, I knit it together with the first stitch that was held on the cable needle. So I'm decreasing 2 of the stitches together, 1 of the stitches from the front and 1 from the back, and then I just worked these 2. So I started with 6 stitches and I ended with 5. So that got rid of 2 stitches, 1 over here and 1 over here. And you can't see that in the fabric right here. You can't tell that there are fewer stitches. Then what I did was, after I worked a couple of rows, I eliminated 2 stitches in the center here. Because when you look at the way the cable crosses, you can see that these cable stitches tend to get wider and narrower depending on what's going on with the cable crossing. And in this original one, you see that those 5 stitches, it just gets spread completely out. But with only 3, everything stays narrow. And the way I got rid of them was, as I was knitting across these stockinette stitches, when I got to the last one, I worked an SSK decrease. So that's so the knit stitch at the final knit stitch here was decreased together with a purl stitch, and so the knit stitch ended up on top and the purl stitch was hidden up underneath. Then I worked the 3 purl stitches that you can see, and then I got rid of the last purl stitch by doing a knit 2 together, and that knit stitch ended up on top. So I got rid of 4 stitches. And that meant that I could do this I-cord across. So what I did was I cast on 27 stitches for each half. And for this half, in addition to just having fewer stitches, I also worked the 3 center stitches so that they would match the gutter here, so that it would pull in maybe just a little bit more. Then, when I did this I-cord, I started out by casting on a few stitches and actually just working a few rows of the 3 stitches before I started working the I-cord and joining the stitches here. So I have like a little flap that comes through the opening right here where the pocket, where those stitches separate. So I just pushed it through here, and then I can tack it down on the back. And then when I finished the bind off, actually started the bind off this direction and went here. So I started here, and then when I finished, I just, after I did the last join, I just worked a few more rows of the stitches so that I can tack on each side. And it was still a little bit wide, so I ripped that out and I did it again, but I used a needle 1 size smaller. So I knit all of this with a size 6 needle, and I knit this with a size 5. And so I have 27 stitches going across the front. What I did, I still have these 31 stitches back here, and I need 31 when I'm going to graft them together. So what I did on the back half was I had 27 stitches, and I worked a purl stitch up the center, and then as I got near the top, I did a couple of increases so that I had 3 stitches in the center, and then I did a couple of increases so that I had 5, so that by the time I got to the very top of the pocket, I was matching the stitch count right here, and then I grafted that to the back. So that's how I solved this. So I'm really happy with how this is going to look. I can go forward with my idea. So now what I want to do is just show you some of the kinds of swatches that I do and why I do them. So this is a swatch that I did a couple of years ago. I wanted to prove that there was yarn or color dominance because some people have been told that when you work one yarn in each hand, then you have tension issues, and that's why one of the stitches is dominant over the other. And this swatch was to prove that I knew that that wasn't the case. I knew that yarn dominance was really a thing, and I proved it by knitting these with both yarns, in each of these in a different way. I don't know which one I did which way. One of them I had both yarns in the right hand and always kept the green yarn in the dominant position, which would be lower. When they're running parallel, the green one was lower, so that one would be dominant. In this one, I may have done one in each hand, and then I did one where both were in the left hand. I'm not sure which one I did which, but regardless, in all cases, the green has yarn dominance because they were parallel floats and the green was always held lower. These are 2 swatches. I meant to do a third one and I never did, and I don't have this yarn anymore. But the idea was, let me back up a little bit. The idea was to create these swatches that were all the same circumference using the same yarn, but at different gauges. So for example, if I wanted to knit a hat that was, my head's 22 inches and I wanted to knit a hat that was 20 inches in circumference, I wanted to see what that would be like with worsted weight yarn when it was knit at the recommended gauge on the ball band of 5 stitches per inch. What would that feel like to have that 2 inches of negative ease worked at the recommended gauge? And then I worked ribbing, a tubular cast on with knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, same needle, and then with knit 2, purl 2 ribbing at the other end. Then I did it for this swatch too, but this was a different gauge. So this one, I don't know which 2 I had. My plan was to do one that was 5.5 stitches per inch, 5 stitches per inch, and then 4.5 stitches per inch. And I haven't measured these, but they're both 20 inches in circumference. And so one of them has more stitches than the other. And the one that has fewer stitches is also at a looser gauge, which means it's got more stretch and it's going to feel looser. And so the idea was to do these experiments so I could tell, first of all, what kind of ribbing I liked on which needle, and then what kind of stockinette gauge felt best to me using that worsted weight yarn. So that was the experiment that I had planned here, and it's only 2/3 of the way done. So these were 2 swatches that I knit for an article that I wrote for Interweave on when you're mixing stranded color work with solid colors and how it can be a good idea to go up a needle size when you're doing the stranded color work portion. And it's not because you're knitting tighter. I mean, you might be, but the point is that the proportion of stitches changes when you switch to stranded color work. the stitches will get narrower, but they also get taller. So it's sort of like if you have a rectangle and then it has the same perimeter, but it changes into a square. So stranded color work tends to get, the stitches tend to get more square. And because of that, because you can have the same number of stitches, the fabric will narrow. But if you go up a needle size for the stranded part, you will get closer to the same gauge in terms of how wide the stitches are when you're transitioning from one to the other. So that was what these were about. And even though I was writing an article on it, I thought it was a really interesting process to go through myself. I learned a lot from just doing that. This is a swatch that I have used to teach people how to seam using reverse duplicate stitch on the back. You knit in a light colored fabric and then you work one row in a contrast color. And then when you look on the back side of it, you can see the path of those stitches really well because they are in a contrast color. And if you knit slightly loosely for whatever kind of yarn you're using, that makes it easier as well. So then you can learn how to follow the path of a row of stitches and you can learn how to weave in your yarn tails using that technique. This is a swatch that is part of a shawl color. So it's a type of shawl color that I see fairly often in men's and boys' sweaters of the early part of the 20th century. And I would read the instructions and I could not picture what was going on. And so finally one time I just said, I'm gonna just do it, and I'm just going to follow the directions. I'm not going to knit the whole sweater, I'm just going to knit the collar. So this part right here is simulating the last few rows. Like the idea is you're working from the bottom of the back up to the neck. So you're getting up to the shoulders. And so knitting across one shoulder and then across the back of the neck. And so you have just a few stitches you're doing, then the other shoulder is just, on waist yarn or something. The shoulders are on waist yarn right now, and you're only working across the back of the neck. And so you work back and forth straight for a while, and then you start doing these increases and until it's a certain length, and then you work straight, and you're working straight for quite a while, and then you're told to reverse the shaping. So now you're doing decreases until you're back down to that original number, and then you work straight. And so then what you do is you sew down that end into the back side of the neck. Well, what you have here is the back of a collar. And so then this is a collar that's done in pieces. And so the V-neck, where you're also creating a shawl collar, it's going to end. You're going to have a double layer of this shawl collar coming up the front of the V, and that gets sewn to these two edges here. So it's a pieced shawl collar that I just could not visualize because modern shawl collar sweaters do not tend to be constructed in that way, and I just needed to understand how it worked. And then this was, I think I did this for a video, but it was a demonstration of how you can use short rows to do particular effects. And I wanted to use this in the video. But like I always do when I make a video, whenever I'm demonstrating something, I always learn a lot from the process myself. So, so it's the kind of thing where I keep in my bin of swatches, and I can pull them out every so often and show as an example. I have this baggie right here. There's a lot more that doesn't fit in this baggie, but this is basically a baggie full of sock parts. So whenever I am learning a new type of heel, or I want to figure out how to modify a particular type of heel for people who have fit issues, I will knit a leg of a sock for a couple of inches, and then I do the heel, and then I knit a couple inches, and then finish it off. So I have examples of a whole bunch of different ways that I can knit heels, or I can do toes, or something that shows how the parts of a sock work, how they work together. But a lot of these are examples of certain types of toes or heels that I have tried out, and they've ended up in videos. Some of them have ended up in videos, but some of them is just for me to learn how they work and whether or not I like them. And then at some point in the future, I might do a video. Like this is one of these types of heels that is a very old type of heel construction. I think it was called the manufacturer's heel maybe. But anyway, it was a very different type of construction than I was used to, and I wanted to see what the process to making it was like. And I used worsted weight yarn for it, and it's not meant to fit anybody in particular. It's just meant to understand how the construction process works. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.